Good morning, everyone. If you are in Glasgow, if you're in London, or in Europe or Africa, in the Sudano-Sahel, indeed, or wherever else you are in the world, welcome. My name is Marta Foresti. I'm the Executive Director of ODI Europe. ODI is a London-based global think tank that works on sort of global affairs and international development. And it is a pleasure for me to chair today this conversation on climate change and migration in the Sudano-Sahel. And on that, a bit more in a minute. This session is co-hosted by the Supporting Pastoralism and Agriculture in Recurrent and Protracted Crisis. So thank God for acronyms, SPARC, of which ODI is a very proud partner, and the British Red Cross. So climate and migration. Before COP, I was thinking, there's going to be so much said at COP on migration and climate. And as others have noticed, commented, actually, there isn't that much conversation on migration and climate during COP. So we are very pleased to have the opportunity to have this conversation today. However, unsurprisingly, there has been quite a lot of commentary on migration and climate in the media. And of course, some politicians have made references to the future that lies ahead with this very high number of people that will threaten us and our living because they will move as a result of climate change. As we will discuss throughout the session, there is of course some truth to these numbers, but I personally find some of this scaremongering unhelpful. The way migration is being manipulated politically is a challenge for those of us who are here trying to find practical solutions to support people who move and those who don't, and the communities where they live, and especially those who are vulnerable, particularly vulnerable as a result of climate change and natural hazards and other factors, including conflict, all of which are at play in the region that we're about to discuss today. I think we really need to move away from what are often oversimplistic dichotomy about migration being a very negative and bad thing, something to be stopped and avoided, or being the ultimate panacea that will make all sorts of development outcomes possible, and to really focus in on the reality, the pragmatic realities of what human mobility looks like, the different forms of it, and what could be done to support human livelihoods for those who move and those who stay. To do that, which is not easy, given the the very politically heated debate that often surrounds questions of migration and questions of climate. One thing we can do is to place this debate in specific geographical and geopolitical contexts, because I think it helps to bring the conversation down to the realities on the ground and to how, in practice, the realities of climate change, migration, and in the context of this region, specifically also conflict, interact. So taking all these factors into account, understanding the why, how, critically when, and how far people move or not is as important as whether they do it, and estimating the numbers and placing the attention to future scenarios about migration or moving the dial back to where we are now and supporting the reality of those who move who are already today affected by the realities of climate change. So the Sudano-Sahel has been characterized by semi-arid and climates for thousands of years. Populations have adapted and learned to these harsh environments through different forms of mobility. I think we should always remember that moving may well be a strategy that people adopt, whether voluntary or not, to adapt to the realities of climate change. And for example, migrating for livestock. Yet we often don't understand nowhere near enough the dynamics of different kinds of movement, and particularly how and whether they are impacted or driven by climate change and other factors, and how the interplay of these factors play out. And in particular, the evidence for the role of sudden onset shocks is clear, and we'll hear more about this from during this conversation. How slow onset shifts are contributing to the decisions to migrate and to the modalities of movement is something on which we have less clarity and evidence on. Conflict and land degradations, both of which are phenomena that are particularly relevant in the region, and competition over resources are linked to insecure land tenure and some of the other factors that also influence movement in some areas. And often, but not always, these factors can be influenced by climate change. I think it's fair to say that this is a region where people move not necessarily as a choice, and are therefore displaced as a result of conflict and natural hazards. However, we also need to remember that, like many other parts of the world, in these regions, in the Sudano-Sahelian countries, there are dynamic economies and they are diversifying economies with growing populations, often rapid urbanization. I have the pleasure of working with a number of African and European cities that are working together, addressing the reality of human mobility. People do tend to move to cities, often locally. And so that poses all sorts of other both challenges, but also opportunities that migration brings to the livelihoods and economic opportunities of people in the region. Migrants can be essential to city and economic growth. I think we've all learned that, a great deal about that during the last 18 months, 2 years of the COVID pandemic. All of this is happening now. There is a tendency in the migration climate debate, as I said earlier, to forecast future scenarios, and typically to the ones that rely on very large numbers of people that could be displaced as a result of climate change. And that risks keeping our attention away from today's realities about the fact that people already move as a result or in connection to climate-related phenomena. And it is on that we should focus our attention, because that's where we have the chance to make a difference in supporting, preventing when needed, supporting and helping people adapt to these reality. So it's time to start examining both the opportunities to harness mobility for conflict-sensitive climate adaptation and mitigation across the Sahel, ensure that both sending and receiving communities are climate resilient, and also not forget the urgent need of protection and support that those who move and those who are prevented from moving as a result of a combination of climate, conflict, and other economic variables in the region actually need and require. So we want to have this conversation today in this hour that we have ahead of us, but there are a number of us who are very involved in sort of climate and migration debates, and we want to continue to remain involved with all of you who are interested. You would have seen also on social media that some active engagement from the migration of the climate community on this topic. I will ask each of the panelists that I'm about to introduce 2 questions. I'll ask them to answer in turn and to try to keep their intervention brief so that we can all have an interesting conversation. At the end of the presentations, I will ask the audience. In fact, my colleague Sarah will facilitate and moderate questions from the audience that then I'll be able to put to the panelists. A few logistical notes. We're all used now to this virtual events, but please be on mute unless you're speaking. Introduce yourself when you take the floor, or indeed when you put your questions in the chat. Please tell us who you are, where you work. And to the speakers in particular, be respectful of the time limits when taking the floor. So send any question via the chat function. And if you want a particular panelist to address your questions, please mention that in your question. And Sarah, the moderator, will curate the questions and put them back to me. If you want to share your reflection on social media, please use Spark Ideas, Red Cross Policy. I also think ODI Climate as a Twitter handle. And you can find also the speakers' Twitter handles online. This meeting is on the record, it's being recorded and will be made available after registration, after today's live broadcast, which is great given that there is a lot of competition at top for events, and especially at this time in the morning. So let me introduce now my 3 speakers. First is Kwasi Dagawa, who is migration advisor for the British Red Cross based in Dakar. He has more than 15 years experience of designing and managing protection and migration program, working with the UN, international NGOs, before joining the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement in West Central and East Africa. We then go to Jan Selby, who's Professor of Politics and International Relations at the University of Sheffield. Jan specializes on issues of climate, water, and energy security, approaching them from a perspective of political ecology, which I think is much needed in the conversations going on at COP. And he also has interest in research on conflict, peace building, and development, which is exactly what we need for this discussion. Jan was also the lead author of a really influential and important rapid evidence assessment looking at the impact of climate on migration that was commissioned by the British government and that is available online, and with some really good infographics that you can find on the ODI website. And it'd be great perhaps if some colleagues could put some links to both the REA and the infographics on the chat so that people can access them, because it provides much needed sort of evidence as a backdrop to the debate we're going to have today. Michele Leone, Senior Program Specialist for Climate Resilient Food Systems Division at the International Development Research Centre, IDRC, Canadian IDRC, I suppose. And he has a PhD in physics of complex systems. He's been working for IDRC since 2010, but he worked on system approach to adaptation and sustainable development in Ottawa, Nairobi, and the Dakar offices. I believe Kwasi and Michele are both today speaking to us from Dakar, whereas Jan is in rural Yorkshire, which is what makes these virtual events all the more interesting. And I am in my London home. So Kwasi, let me pose the first question to you, and I'll go with the same question in turn to others. How does the fact that people move or not fit into the existing resilience strategies of communities across the Sudano-Sahel? So what already exists and what is already in place in terms of resilience in this community, and how the fact that people move makes a difference. Over to you, Kwasi. Thanks. And please stick to your 5 minutes.
Thank Sarah. I will keep my camera off because of the connection issue here in Dakar. And, you know, I will start by saying, in response to your question, that migration is part of the West Africa, including Sahel population lifestyle over the decades. And according to the IOM, there are an estimated 8.4 migrants around the West African region. As you know, the root causes and the reason for migration are deep and multi-causal. Though it will be really simplistic and limitative to draw a linear correlation between migration and climate change. However, in the last couple of years, we have seen how the climate change has exacerbated migration around the Sahel region, and we do expect that this situation will increase in the coming years. As you know, the Sahel region population is more than 80% rural, and their economic activities are mainly rain-fed agriculture and pastoralism. Lately, we have seen a lot of changes in the rainfall and the seasonal pattern in the region. We have seen sometimes too little or too much rain, or delays in the seasonal coming in the region, with their set of drought, floods, locust invasion, soil degradation, and coastal erosion. All these have led to the disruption of the population's livelihood and their economic activities, with a growing food insecurity. We have seen also pastoralists who stayed longer in some locations than they used to do in the past. So, facing all this situation, the population has to find ways and means to adapt to it, or to cope with those new situations they are living. And some members of the population opt for migration as a resilience way to find jobs in the new location where they will go and send remittances to their countries or to relocation to support their family, while some of them who do not have the money or the necessary resources to migrate are stranded and trapped in their location, where they also develop new ways to adapt or to cope with the situation in order to survive. We can come back onto that later on. And I would like to say that most often those migrations induced by climate change are seasonal, temporary, rural to urban, inter-regional or intra-regional, or within the countries. And in the location where those people are moving to or are migrating to, they do face a lot of challenges, especially having their basic needs met. They are at a lot of protection risks, namely exploitation, abuse, or even trafficking, and they do not even have the minimum basic needs satisfied. So those are the situations what we are facing. I do not have enough time, otherwise I will give some concrete examples to support that, but during the discussion, we can get onto that. Yeah, I will stop there for the moment and hand over to Martha. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kwasi. Can I say to the other two speakers, Kwasi was exactly 5 minutes, so you now all have to live up to the same performance. Kwasi sort of framing very helpfully the debate and reminding us about the key characteristics of people who move in the region, which are indeed, I suspect, Jan, is quite similar to what we find in a number, generally speaking, on the characteristics of human mobility and migration related to climate. So it's temporary, typically rural to urban, challenges around both the immediate livelihoods for those who move, but also finding jobs and economic opportunities, the ability to remit, and also not to forget those who are stranded, those who actually are prevented from moving as a result of a combination of factors. So Jan, the same questions to you. From the work that you've done, how and whether moving is part of the strategies that people have for resilience and adaptation. Please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Marta. And yes, absolutely. There's lots of resonances to the findings that my colleagues have had. But helpfully, I think I want to make some rather different points. So I want to make 3 quick points. The first general point that I want to make is that I think we need to be quite careful when thinking about climate change and migration in the Sahel, not to reproduce various myths about it. The sort of risks that I'm thinking of are that life in the Sahel is particularly precarious, that there is an ever-present risk of the Sahel being swallowed up by the desert, that life there is dictated and communities are made what they are above all by environmental forces and environmental limits, and that, like the Sahara, the Sahel has a timeless quality to it, which makes it immune to development. These are all myths of European colonial origin, which still today are widely reproduced or implicitly there in discussions of climate vulnerability and climate migration in the region. I think there are some real dangers that in wanting to emphasize how climate change is increasing and will increase vulnerabilities, we fall into some quite problematic framings, some climate or environmentally deterministic framings, ones which I think are not only empirically inaccurate, but also often have colonial and even racist undertones. Turning to the evidence, the second point I want to make is that, at least in English language publications, there is little clear evidence so far of climate change contributing to migration in the Sahel. This is one of the findings of the evidence assessment which Marta mentioned, which is much broader than just on the Sahel, but includes a specific section on it. Let me highlight just 2 of our findings in particular. One is that we did not identify a single expert study that demonstrated impacts so far of the long-term temperature increases occurring in the Sahel, as elsewhere, of course, on migration. And the other is that short-term temperature and rainfall shocks in the Sahel have sometimes been found to be associated with increased migration, but sometimes with decreased migration, and sometimes with neither. Now, this matches what is evidently a broader pattern, which is that while the destruction caused by weather shocks is in some circumstances associated with increased migration, in other times or places, or for different social groups, it can lead to decreased migration because of how shocks reduce economic capacities to migrate. Now, there are evidently two contradictory processes at work here. Climate-related shocks can simultaneously contribute to and impede migration. And then the third point I want to make is that migration is not just, in the Sahel as elsewhere, should not just, in my view, be considered a resilience strategy. It's also a response to economic opportunities and development. To start with, I think we need to recognize, and this builds on something that Marta said as well, we need to recognize that Sahelian economies are not timeless and unchanging at all, but are modern and dynamic, if also, of course, extremely poor. Integrated into the global economy, marketized, for the most part neoliberalized, and constantly affected by technological developments, commodity price fluctuations, and so on. And migration patterns are affected by this too. Let me just give one example relating to Darfur, though it speaks to a more general pattern. From the 1960s onwards, Darfur's economy was fundamentally transformed, thanks above all to two developments: the extension of Sudan's national rail line into the region, and the uptake of diesel-powered tube wells, which for the first time enabled systematic exploitation of plentiful groundwater resources. Together, these developments completely transformed Darfur's agricultural sector, and in the process spurred migration. Pastoralist communities moved decisively into farming, often migrating and settling new lands in the process. This led to a rapid expansion of South Darfur's population, where opportunities for irrigated horticulture were the greatest. Darfur as a whole witnessed significant in-migration, and many of those who migrated were relatively wealthy, migrating to take advantage of new economic opportunities. My point here is simply that patterns of migration and mobility in Darfur and across the Sahel more broadly have long been shaped by changing economic opportunities. And unfortunately, that a lot of commentary ignores this. And as in Darfur, has repeatedly mistaken what is essentially economic migration as evidence of the impacts of climatic factors and as a resilience strategy. So I think we need to be quite careful to try to avoid this. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. I mean, I agree with your sort of your encouragement for all of us to be careful, and to be careful, particularly in sort of reaching simplistic and unhelpful conclusions or sound bites around some of this. At the same time, we need to be somewhat daring, because much as some of the evidence is unconclusive, there is actually plenty of experience to build on and actually to support countries and economies. Let me also say that I think your first very important point about the risk of perpetuating colonial and unhelpful framing, which is true of Africa, is particularly true of the Sahel and anything that is around the Sahara Desert, I think is directly related to your last point, that we then fail to identify and to frame some of these debates around the realities of economic development and opportunities that migration is associated with, which doesn't take anything away from some of the difficult circumstances that people find themselves in and the need to support and protect those populations. But I think failing to recognize both aspects of the reality of moving, and also, as I said, of not being able to do so is fundamental. So, Michele, over to you again with these questions about whether migrating or moving or not is a useful strategy, is a useful resilience sort of strategy, but also bearing in mind some of the framing that the two previous speakers have provided to us. Michele, over to you.
Thanks, Marta. And I'm not sure I'll make a good job in keeping that time. For sure, I'm not as good as the previous speakers. But I like the to keep a bit the format that Ian followed when in introducing this theme, is that the need to dispel some myths about migration in the Sahel, but migration linked to climate and environmental change in general. And I think there are other myths that have already been said in a way or another by the other panelists, but I would like to restate. One, which is especially true in the Sahel, is the myth that migration and human mobility are the same thing. They are not the same thing. Of course, they are interrelated. They've been intertwined, but they are not the same thing. The human mobility is often, a sequence of cycling movements, and it's kind of linked to a system of natural livelihoods that do not necessarily implying long-term and the definite movement of people from a place to another, but cycling movements. The second myth is that migration has been mainly international, and this is also something that we haven't seen. We've seen, and that there's a mounting evidence for that migration continues to be mainly intra-national and intra-regional in the Sahel, although it is true that these patterns are changing and may change in the future. The third is that migration is acting somehow on a blank slate. Migration due to climate change is acting on like a pattern of non-existing previous movement of people, and this is absolutely not true. And the history of pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial have influenced tremendously the current mobility patterns. Overlapping them with slavery praxis, religious proselytism, forces relocation due to the need of moving labor forces in coastal plantations, so on and so forth. And by drawing boundaries between countries that are not boundaries between peoples and nations, and therefore creating imbalances that in turn created new fluxes that are not fluxes of natural cyclic mobility, but so this is, it's a big heritage of history that we have in this Sahel, and we've seen the consequences of it with the signature on the nature of migration that is still stronger than the signature that we can attribute to the environmental or climate change. The other myth that I would like to talk about is that migration in the Sahel and in the global South more broadly is a young male business. We've seen that migration is highly gendered, and the gender and the intersection patterns of migrations have been changing. Have been changing in the sense that women have been moving more. The size of households that have at least one migrant member have been changing in the past decades. Sometimes with the size increasing and sometimes decreasing, with a pattern that is not a linear pattern, as Kwasi and Ian also suggested in their in their speech. So I think what we've seen, and I will stop here for the moment, is the need for more evidence on, to understand how these migratory fluxes have been changing, and also the need to see how can services and resources for people that may not want to migrate can themselves migrate and move in order to balance some and to fulfill some of the aspiration and the needs of people on the move. Thank you.
Thank you, Michele, and again for all the three of you for being so to the point and factual. So Michele helped us to also dismantle some of the last few myths that we still had hanging over our discussion. Women move as much or increasingly as men. A lot of the movement is local, and it's, of course, is not a blank slate and has a history in the region. And it's certainly not something that we just should discuss in terms of something that's going to happen in the future. So having sort of cleared the air from what we know and what we don't know, let me say that as much as we need to exercise caution, particularly on, causal relationship between climate and migration, we actually have highlighted in the last 15 minutes a number of areas where we actually know an awful lot about who moves, how people move, how far they go, when people move, and in relation to and in interacting with climate factors and event natural hazards, as well as conflict, and a number of economic factors at play in the region. So based on now what we know and what is needed and what can be done, let's now move the conversation to what lessons can be learned and therefore applied in practice to support the communities, those who move, those who don't, and the so-called sort of sending as well as host communities. So Kwasi, over to you for the experience of the British Red Cross in what lessons can be drawn and applied supporting communities in the region.
Thank you, Martha. My intervention will revolve around three main lessons. The first one is around as humanitarians to act now instead of waiting for the natural hazard disaster to happen before responding. We need to anticipate in our action, trying to do some anticipatory action to prepare the community to be resilient or to face those challenges. The most important point I would like to highlight in that area is to how we need as humanitarians to involve the local community, the local population in defining the solution or the preparedness action that we need to take to get ready or to overcome those challenges. Most often, we come as, we know everything, bringing solutions from outside, but it does not often work. So based on our experience in the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, it is important for us to involve, to have the voice of the local community heard in defining those solutions. One example also related to the anticipatory action that we experienced in the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement is the forecast-based funding initiative that we developed in the Red Cross movement, which are currently ongoing in Niger and Mali, that show how we have to be prepared for the climate shock or anything, so we can reduce the cost and the impact of those shocks on the population. The second point I would like to raise also is related to the legal status or regulations around climate-induced migrants. As of now, we know that there are some legislations, some regulations around there to protect refugees, to protect internally displaced people, but they are lacking some protection measure for climate-induced migrants. We know that lately there have been a lot of discussions going on to recognize and find a way to even define what we mean by climate-induced migration. So we will urge the international community to act quickly to recognize that and find ways or define legislation for us to protect those people who are facing a lot of challenges. And the third point I would like to raise here is related to the funding of the migration programming. Most often, the migration program funding are related to international migration or to prevent migration. But as both Jan and Michele had said, the climate-induced migration are mainly regional or within countries and so on. So we will ask donors to be flexible and go away from that international migration funding to have it broad to include all those migrants. I know that the African countries are not able to support the needs of all those people migrating into their country. So we need to have programming that will incorporate, that will include those migrants who are not going abroad but who are turning around the region. So I will leave it there for the moment and then we...
Thank you. Thank you, Kwasi, for pointing in some very clear direction, anticipate the legal status of migrants, and funding, of course, is linked to international migration, and at times, I would add, also explicitly linked to preventing international migration, particularly to the shores of those international donors, whereas much more localized funding to support local human mobility, including internal urban to rural to urban, and sometimes the other way around, will be much more pragmatic and needed. Jan, what does your research say about what could be done to support communities in the region?
So thanks, Marta. I'm going to give a slightly more academic answer. Two points. The first thing I want to say is to sort of take issue with the framing of the question. What lessons should be taken on board to ensure the resilience of those on the move? Because I think that ensure the resilience I also think that's a problematic framing. I mean, let me illustrate that by bringing in one recent report that many of you may be aware of. The Groundswell report on climate change and migration by the World Bank, which is a big modelling of possible future climate migration globally up to 2050, including discussion of sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, not the Sahel specifically, and they project that by 2050, according to their most pessimistic scenario, 85 million climate migrants there may be within sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, over 4% of the region's population. Now, personally, I think this type of modelling and headline figure is not particularly realistic and not particularly helpful. And the main reason I think that is that, and they're explicit on this in the report, there's no allowances made for adaptation at all, and no allowance indeed for any technological or economic development. Once you allow for those, it becomes clear that resilience is not something that external actors simply give, but something which is practiced by people and communities. And discussions of resilience need to start with that recognition, it seems to me. And then the other point that I want to make is that I don't think we should imagine that climate-related migration in the Sahel may or will only be caused by long-term heating or by climatic shock events, that is, by environmental pressures. In addition, I think we need to be aware that there are significant risks of migration and displacement occurring as a result of maladaptation, That is as a result of poorly conceived or implemented climate adaptation initiatives. The very brief example I want to give relates to Lake Chad. Lake Chad is, as many of you will know, regularly represented as a victim of climate change, as shrinking or even disappearing because of climate change-induced drought. Again, and in line with what I've said before, this is misleading. Lake Chad has been stable or slightly increasing in size in recent years, and the main reason it has not recovered more appears to be upstream irrigation rather than climatic factors. Nonetheless, on the back of this shrinking lake narrative, a lot of interests have converged, pushing for a huge water transfer project to refill the lake with water from the Congo basin. Now, I have doubts about whether this project will go ahead, but there is significant local and international interest in it, Chinese and Italian government interest, and it's been pushed at times by the Nigerian and Chadian governments, amongst others. But the point I want to make is this, irrespective of the question of whether it's likelihood of it going ahead or not, that I have no doubt that if it did go ahead, the project would have very significant and quite regressive migration and displacement, as well as conflict and security consequences. We know historically that mega projects of this ilk often have a range of negative consequences. And the main lesson I'd like to see taken on board in this point here is beware of facile accounts that overstate the role of climate change in causing social and ecological crises in the Sahel, or indeed elsewhere, as this is a recipe for misconceived adaptation programs and initiatives, that is for maladaptation, and may itself have unintended negative consequences, including contributing to migration. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. And actually, your slightly more academic point, I think, is well taken and very useful. I sometimes feel, and I might be oversimplistic in saying that here the overlay between, on the one hand, the opposing and polarizing narratives on displacement versus economic migration on the one hand, and on the other, resilience versus adaptation and even mitigation in the climate space has ended up, unhelpfully sort of having us sitting on fences or taking sort of sides on what should be a much more grand debate on that stems from evidence and what works. And I think actually having this conversation based in a region like the Sahel is helpful precisely because it could drive so many of those dichotomies and those unhelpful framing. I'm seeing in the chat that unfortunately our audience is experiencing some technical issues, that the streaming comes and goes. It works well for me if all of you can continue to make sure you've switched off apps on your laptops, and I'm talking about the speakers, so make sure there's no interference. But beyond that, I'm not sure there's too much we can do, other than, of course, going to Michele for his reflections on what can we do, what lessons can be learned on resilience. But as Jan perhaps suggested, let's not take this too narrowly and maybe focus more on what can be done to support the experiences and the opportunities for those who move in the region and those who stay.
Sure, thanks, Marta. I think I wanted to be provocative, let's say, and focus on one main lesson, at least that is emerging from the research we've been supporting, that in order to better harness, I would say, although I don't like this term, human mobility and migration in the Sahel, but around the world, the best thing we can do is to lower walls to human movements and mobility. So to allow people to move freely, especially in this Sahel, the current strategies, livelihood strategies that also contribute to resilience to environmental change, are based mainly on the possibility of free movement, or at least extended movement, so as to adapt access to pastures and to water resources. This has been limited, by large water infrastructure projects, damming in rivers like the Niger, the Volta, the Senegal River, triggering movements that were not there before. And I completely agree with Ian that a project like the Transaqua project, that is the one Ian was referring to, I'm not sure if this is still the name adopted, is it can potentially have, you know, large impacts on people mobility. And I'm surprised that very few people know about it. So one thing that a lesson learned from this is that the knowledge about this project should be made more publicly available and discussed. You know, access to land and water, land fragmentation, unclear land tenure rights, and legal rights are all, you know, fragmenting the possibility for people to continue have a normal or a decent livelihoods, and therefore they are boundaries to movement that encourage people to move. Ironically, it seems contradictory, but this is what we've seen. Something else that we've learned, and I think it's a lesson worth exploring, is that migration and mobility is not only a matter of people. It's mobility of ideas, mobility of food, mobility of services, and mobility of rights, because people move, taking their rights with them. And sometimes, you know, services and money, they are actually more mobile than people, and they are less influenced by barriers. So what we've seen, for instance, is there is a lot of potential in redirecting and rethinking the way we use remittances in the Sahel. Remittances that have been traditionally moved, you know, privately within households and used for non-productive outputs and outcomes, like building in the real estate or buying goods that are kind of luxury goods that families of non-migrants cannot afford. But we've been seeing that there is a potential to kind of make remittances semi-private and semi-public, to discuss at the municipal level, for instance, how to use remittances in a way that can be productive and can contribute to the resilience of the local communities. So this is something to take advantage of the mobility of those services that are less influenced by the physical barriers to movements that actually affect people and migrants.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michele, but also Kwasi and Jan, for very clear, fascinating insights ranging from sort of academic research to sort of lessons, very practical lessons in that to be applied, and also for the provocation, Michele. There's nothing that we like more in the UK for a good debate about free movement these days and the benefits of it. So let me move to. We have a couple of questions from the audience I would like to put to some of you. So there was one that Mark Redwood posed earlier on, probably as initially when Jan was discussing the nature of the evidence, that I would like actually to pose not just to Jan, but to all of you, because the question is about what exactly do you see as the key evidence that is missing, and how should we go about researching the migration-climate interface? And the reason why I would like all of you to think about it is because one way to look at this question is the research, is the evidence that is missing from a research and academic perspective. But I would like to hear, particularly from Kwasi, what evidence and research would be useful to inform practice. And of course, the fact that, and also whether we're talking about evidence that is missing because is yet to be produced, or also simply the fact that the evidence is mixed and unconclusive, because that's what the reality of the the relationship is. So first, this question about evidence, and then we have a specific question to Jan on the Lake Chad from Celeste Hicks. Thanks, Jan, for the point about the Lake Chad that Celeste has also been written about, but it's one of the most enduring myths of the Sahel and climate change. Do you think it could still have value if it inspires better mitigation efforts in the rest of the world? I.e., could it serve as a poster child? Imagine that, an example from this region, and rather than misguided attempts to rectify the water levels, as you say. So let's first take this question on the evidence that we have and the evidence we don't have, then specifically, Jan, pick up the question on Chad, and then I'll come back with one final, very quick round. We have about 10 minutes left, so we'll need to be even quicker in our responses. Jan, do you want to start?
Yeah, thanks very much. So what evidence is missing? So the first thing to say is that there is definitely evidence missing from our review. Our review was a rapid evidence review, and it was a review firstly of academic and expert studies only. So it was not a review of journalistic reports or let alone lay and local non-expert perspectives. And secondly, it was a review solely of English language publications, and that's particularly important in relation to the Sahel, given that there's quite a paucity of work in English language on the Sahel, clearly much more in French. I freely acknowledge these limitations to the report. Hopefully it nonetheless contains some useful things. I don't think it's the final word on the subject at all. In terms of what evidence, what types of evidence we think are missing, well, there is an awful lot of evidence on the migration impacts of environmental shocks and climate shocks. There is much less evidence, however, and much of that evidence is very, very nuanced, very interesting, very good, if full of contradictions as well. The evidence in terms of thinking and trying to work out what the long-term implications of climate change might be is much weaker, however, both on a global level and regionally. It tends to be dominated by sort of earth science and modeling perspectives, which don't sufficiently allow for and incorporate the more social and socioeconomic dimensions of migration, the sort of thing that migration experts all know about. So thinking and working on how to bring sort of insights from that type of work into thinking about the future seems to me to be one of the major challenges and one of the main things that's currently missing.
Great, thank you, Jan. Let me go over to Michele, maybe. Both these questions about the evidence that is missing. There is also a comment here about something that we have not discussed, which is the idea that migration tends to perpetuate existing inequalities. And I wonder whether you want to say something about it, particularly in light of some of the things that Jan reminded us, and you also, on actually the potential of migration to enhance opportunities in economic development. But over to you for actually what probably going to be last final thoughts, given time constraints.
Sure. Thanks, Marta. Thanks. I think for sure, I'll start with something that Ian already said. I think evidence of, how mobility patterns will change in time is still missing, and there will always be need to that as we move into the future. Then I think we often speak, we are here speaking about the Sudano-Sahel, but the Sudano-Sahel is a huge region populated by very different cultures, communities, languages, and hundreds of millions of people. So we talk in general, but actually we have quantitative evidence from small pockets of geographical areas. And from there, we extrapolate what we know in the whole region. So more case studies, more evidence from areas where we haven't conducted research. I think it's still missing. I think that there is the need of more evidence on the evolution of the gender nature of migration, how women perceive migration, and how vulnerability of women changes with changing mobility patterns when they do not move, and when they do move more than in the past, when they move with men, and when they move in different regions from where men have moved. And finally, I think there is lack of evidence on how to better link migrants' rights to the environmental justice movement, and which is gaining a lot of traction right now. But the link between the rights of the human rights of migrants and environmental justice and rights has not been exposed enough and investigated enough. What was the second question? Sorry, Marta.
There was not. It was actually not a question. It's a comment about the fact that we haven't discussed the fact that migration can perpetuate the existing inequalities. I just wonder whether you have a very quick thought on that.
Well, we've been seeing how migration and mobility can be an adaptation strategy, but also a failure of adapt. And when it is a reaction or an incapacity to react, it can become a big conveyor belt, a big transfer mechanism for vulnerability, from one place to another, from one group to another, or also vulnerability that used to be vulnerability to climate change in the place maybe of origin of migrants, and it changes to vulnerability to something else. For instance, increased vulnerability to crime for families that then move into cities, especially with women with children, or increased vulnerability to political insecurity and conflicts.
Thank you.
I think this is this is how to evidence on how to avoid that migration becomes a large conveyor belt of vulnerability across the globe. This is definitely important.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Michele. Sorry, I want to rush you because I've got the last 2 minutes, and I want to make sure Kwasi has a chance for literally 2 minutes for some final thoughts.
Yeah, I would just want to reflect or add a few things on what Jan and Michele have said about what evidence is missing. Right now, one thing also for us practitioners that we cannot find is the data around the population moving due to migration. It seems when you talk about it, it seems like it is more anecdotal than having figures to support what we are seeing. We need those data to support our thing. And like Michele was saying, we need a lot of case studies and anecdotes from the local community who are living that situation to inform our way of thinking and our programming. Regarding the perpetuation of the inequality, I do agree with the comment of the person, since we have seen, in some location, I have one example in Burkina Faso, in which I will not go into now, where in a village, most of the person who left the location are men, leaving women in those locations. So when you get in that location, what will strike you is the high number of women in the location who become now head of household with all the responsibility that led to. So there will be a perpetuation of how women have been, inequally supported by the migration or implied migration. So I will leave it there for the moment.
Thank you very much, Kwasi. Thank you very much also, Michele and Jan, for a really engaging discussion. I think we can prove that even with everything and the frenzy that goes on around COP, we're still able to have very informed, to the point, interesting and dynamic discussion. Okay, sorry, I was distracted by a comment in the chat that are relevant, useful, and in fact much needed. I'll leave you with 3 things. The first is the last that Kwasi mentioned: women, gender. Is incredible how still little attention we pay to the reality of women who move and women who don't. There's some noise. Sorry, and the second is what Jan said at the beginning. I think when it comes to Africa in general and anything that relates to human mobility in and from Africa, and particularly so in areas like the Sudano-Sahel that have been, affected over the years by conflict and a number of other factors, and where countries have particular challenges that will really make an effort to move away from unhelpful framing that prevent us to look at the realities of economic development and opportunities that exist in the region, and how the fact that people move can contribute to that. And then finally, time. We heard that where the evidence is weak is in long-term forecasting, particularly, and also how little we know about the dimension of population movement and the extent to which it can be linked to climate change. Let me perhaps be as provocative as Michele earlier and say, can we actually not pay too much attention, recognize that limit, and see that there is a real risk in some of the narratives around migration and climate, that because we look at the future and the potential threat further down the line of lots of people moving our way and threatening our way of life as a result of climate change in an attempt to create a sense of urgency and crisis around climate, really distracts from the opportunities to focus on the realities of those who are moving now, those who are moving, those who are not moving, the way they do it, for how long they do it, where they move to, who they are, because there is an awful lot that we actually know about these realities. And to be even more provocative, my take and my opinion on this is that we should actually stop focusing on migration as such, because it is actually, the fact that people move is a fundamental feature and dimension of human and economic development. And that's what we should frame it as, rather than as a matter of who's allowed through the border or not. And with that final thought, thank you again very much to all of you. Thank you to Spark, the British Red Cross, and ODI for hosting this fascinating discussion. And I hope to see you hopefully in real life sometime soon. Goodbye.